That make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we woman and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Open World podcast. We have Professor Clive Thomas with us here. Today we're going to divert a little bit from our usual discussion about Guyana and go a little to our wider Caribbean. At the last meeting, the CARICOM heads of government announced that they would, from next year, be opening movement of people within the CARICOM region for all categories. Prior to that, we know that the movement was restricted to people with degrees from the University of the West Indies, certain professionals and so forth. Now, it seems that from next year, all Caribbean people will be able to move within the CARICOM region. Now, that, of course, has consequences. When they move, what about education? Will they be able to access education? Will they be able to access health care? Those are all things that would come with this new initiative. Many people have hailed it as a good step forward for our region. As you know, we've been grappling and trying with Caribbean integration, going back at least to the Federation in 1958 to 1962. And for those who've been working tirelessly to bring us closer together as a region, this must be a landmark decision, so long as we're able to keep this schedule that the heads of government have announced. I'd like to welcome all of you to Politics 101, our podcast, our Open World podcast edition of Politics 101, wherever you're joining us from, whether you're joining us from Guyana, the wider Caribbean, you're joining us from North America or Europe, or right here in South America across the border in Suriname, French Guyana. All of you Guyanese and non-Guyanese, welcome to today's podcast. Professor Clive Thomas. We're going to be talking about what is the meaning of this new announcement that all categories of people, all categories of labor, I guess the economists would say, could now move freely within our Caribbean. What does this mean for Caribbean integration? And since we are operating out of Guyana, what does it mean for Guyana? Guyana, as you know, has changed in terms of its economic outlook. However we twist it, however we turn it, the fact of the matter is that we have oil, we are exporting oil, and that puts us in a different category. Only this past week, I think the World Bank announced that Guyana has now moved out of the category of poor countries, and we have moved into the high income category now. These things are moving despite all the difficulties that we have. We also had the opposition leader announcing that the APNU has now embraced the Buxton proposal, which was put forward by Professor Clive Thomas on behalf of the WPA in 2018. He proposed it in Buxton at the UC Guyana annual symposium, and it's been 5 years. And this past Sunday, at a rally in Georgetown. Finally, the APNU has embraced it. Uh, the leader of the opposition, Aubrey Norton, announced it. So there's a lot happening on the economic front, and we'll try to get Professor Thomas to weigh in on some of them. But the focus today is on the movement of labor, all categories of labor throughout the Caribbean. Let's bring in Professor Clive Thomas. Professor Thomas, how are you?
Many thanks, David. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. You have been, I would say, one of the pioneers as far as scholar activists are concerned. We've been working on Caribbean integration. We have spoken on this program about it from time to time. And some of the earlier studies and the later studies you've been involved with. When you got the news that there is likely next year to be movement of labor for all categories of people in the Caribbean, what was your response?
Well, to begin with, I didn't think that it was just likely. I took it as a done fact. So I'm working the presumption that this will become a reality not later than March next year, as they themselves said at the heads of government meeting that was held in Trinidad and Tobago. One of the aims behind any integration movement, although this was not the case at the beginning of the CARICOM or the CARICOM movement, when we were, myself and Dr. Brewster, who has since died, were asked to prepare a document giving some guidance as to how they might approach the integration of the Caribbean region. And we wrote that book, which is called The Dynamics of West Indian Economic Integration. And that book argued that the purpose of an integration movement within the region is in effect to create a single homogeneous market, not only for goods and services, but for the factors of production, which would include labor, so labor, capital, services. So the free movement of all of these things would become part and parcel of the West Indian reality. So in effect, what we are creating is a single state in an economic sense among the West Indian countries. And that is basically the aim of all integration movements. There was an original theory which still remains in the textbooks by trade theorists in the Western world, that free trade, the free movement of goods and services, will lead to the equalization of the prices of the factors of production in the region that is practicing free trade. That it can substitute the movement of goods and services, can in effect substitute for the actual movement of the factors of production. Our thesis is that the markets of the West Indian states are so small, so disaggregated, that freedom of movement had to take place as well of the factors of production if we were to create in effect a single state in terms of economic dimension. And you could not leave that to the markets to generate by just creating free and fair trade. You had to do it with as well by bringing the factors of production into play. And so we've always championed the view that we should have some movement of labor, some free movement of capital, some free movement of the trade and services, because that's very different from goods. And that on that basis, that is how we will develop economies in a collective and harmonious way so that we benefit from the economies of scale, which is necessary for all competitive production in this world today. So from that point of view, the movement towards the clearing up of the market impediments through barriers to trade, through restrictions by governments, is very welcome. And I would hope that by March next year, we have as much as we can practically do. But I'm also a realist, and I realize that we have special circumstances here in the region, which would make it practically a very difficult things to do. Because while we're a small region, all the countries are small, there's significant variations in our size. including population-wise. Some states are so small that the best description of them should be micro rather than small states, because they are so tiny in effect. Like, say, some islands can fit in the Essequibo River, which is just one river in Guyana, one of the three main rivers. So the disparity in size, the disparities in population are stark, even within the West Indian region. And we have to regulate trade and the movement of the factors of production to compensate for that. For example, in a medical service or whatever, any other business, you might need 4 or 5 specialists in one country. If you entirely free up the market for that type of specialist labor, any one of the bigger countries would be able to supply all that labor. So that means you're giving no support to the creation of indigenous development for your own people. So governments tend to naturally want to resist that happening. So we believe in the planned and coordinated movement towards the wide and wider freer movement of persons. So I welcome the decision, but I think that it doesn't end the need for us to plan and to project and to carefully monitor the freedom of movement, so that we do it within the capacity of the regions, individual states, recognizing that they vary. They vary because of geography, they vary because of history, they vary really de facto. You can't avoid it. And some of them are too small to just absorb these economies or the difficulties that are created, by the free movement of labor. Because the free movement of labor within or any part of the world creates disruptions. Even in the big United States, there's big differences between what might be happening in the northeastern United States and what might be happening in the deeper parts of the Southwest. The states, even though theoretically there's one market and there's freedom of movement, it's difficult to ensure that the factor prices and the availability of opportunities are so equal that you can turn a blind eye to it. In fact, in a country like the United States, that is built it's called the United States because it's built on the foundation of states. So each state itself would have to put in place mechanisms and laws and arrangements to ensure that this free movement that can take place within the national territory does not disadvantage the particular state. We would have to do the same thing in the Caribbean region if we were to get the best out of the free movement of labor.
Professor, sorry, go ahead. I thought you were finished.
Well, I was about to say, in effect, creating a United States of the West Indies.
Yes, and there's actually a calypso sung by the Mighty Bomber called the United States.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Right. And Professor, I noticed you use the word planned and not regulate. Is that intentional? And is there a difference between a planned operation and regulating the movement of people?
Well, the two have elements. When I say planned, it has elements of regulation. Because the point that I want to convey is that we can't rely on the market stimuli to achieve this result. It would not happen naturally. The governments, which are the strongest institutions in the region, by far, and who do not fall for the pretense of the private sector that they can deliver development or they can guarantee that the states have achieved the level of economic well-being that they are capable of. You need a government to be able to do that. That is a definite reality that we've come across. So we have to put the government as a purposeful actor in all these arrangements, because the market itself is not strong enough, competitive enough, far-reaching enough to guarantee that the outcome will be efficient and effective and fair. If you leave it to the market alone, you'll get wide disparities in outcome. And if that occurs, then people turn against the movement of labor and call for its abandonment. And the worst thing we can have is to turn back the clock. Once we haven't taken this step, I think it's very important that we don't have to reverse it. So I would advise a really serious and studious and really calculated approach towards the free movement of labor. And I think also it recognizes the significance of Guyana being in a situation with oil. Because the biggest growth in the labor market for the region will be Guyana. And that is not oil employment, because oil itself will not employ so many people. But the multiply effect or the linkages effect, or both of them, will generate so much employment that we must find a means of ensuring that the Caribbean nationals, who by history and everything else, culture, everything else that I can think of, deserve it, should be primary beneficiaries of our windfall gains in finding oil.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Professor, I'm glad you went there, because I was going to go there later. There is a view in the Eastern Caribbean countries, the OECS countries, that this shift towards the free movement of labor would see a flocking of people to the shores of those quote unquote mini states in the first instance. Do you share that view?
Well, I share that view to some extent, but I think one of the countries where that might have been stimulated from, Guyana, now finds itself with a demand for labor.
Yes.
So to some extent, the dynamics of the populations in the Caribbean region now favor that type of movement. Because Guyana is no longer a supplier of labor, we are a demander of labor. We want people to come to Guyana to help to fill needed jobs and so forth. That will be the outcome that will eventually manifest itself. But they will be coming not just to work in oil, because the oil employment is not so many persons. I think right now we probably employ less than 5,000 people directly in oil. Many people don't know that. Mm-hmm. So the growth and the expansion of oil depends on what the oil industry purchases locally, whether the markets or other companies providing them with services, and through the linkages they create as a result of that, as well as the people in the oil industry who are earning salaries and incomes and making profits and so on, the businesses. What they spend, that creates an income multiplier effect on the rest of the economy and generates jobs. So the jobs will be more direct, more indirect than direct. Directly created, yeah.
Yes, Professor Clive Thomas here. We're talking today about the free movement of all categories of labor that is slated to come on stream next year, 2024, as announced by the heads of government at the recent CARICOM meeting.
It was the 50th anniversary, yeah.
The 50th anniversary of CARICOM. Professor, a practical question. Lots of the people who are watching this program are all over the Caribbean, Guyanese all over the Caribbean, and I want to ask, when this thing is formally put in place, what changes the next day for people who have already been migrating to all parts of the Caribbean? Jamaicans moving to Antigua, Antiguans moving to Barbados, Guyanese moving to Antigua. What changes for these people the next day?
For people who are already moving freely,
yes,
nothing changes,
basically.
Okay. Except that they have a legal right to residence. They satisfy the regulations by law, and therefore they have an entitlement. They're not here at the the good wishes of the immigration department. They're here as a consequence of being a citizen of the Caribbean region, of the West Indian Federation of the CARICOM. So they are here as an entitled citizen. And that's a difference from being just a visitor. And it's an important psychological difference because it gives you roots in the society. It makes you feel that you have a right to be here. And I think it stimulates the contributions you can make to the society and its development. Because don't underestimate it. The most creative and productive of our people tend to migrate because of lack of opportunities here at home. So we, by welcoming migrants, are welcoming some of the cream of the crop in the West Indian region. Because some countries live on that. They guarantee free movement to the entrepreneurs just coming in, guarantee them a livelihood, guarantee them citizenship, because they know what the spirit of entrepreneurship brings with it. From people who have migrated and done so legally and voluntarily, and what they can bring to their own societies when they come to that spirit of innovation and adventure.
And so therefore the psychological is very important.
It's very important.
It's very important.
But I also have another sneaky ambition, because we used to suffer so much in the hard times. I've always felt that Guyanese who were allowed into many countries at the great reluctance on their part in the rest of the Caribbean region, that we should show by our example that we were better than they were willing to be to us. I feel that is the way in which we teach ourselves and the way in which we learn going forward. I would not like to engage in tit for tat. I was a privileged person in the region because most people will recognize my face. As soon as I got to the airport, my name is known in every Caribbean island.
Yes.
So I never had any problems with immigration at any time. I was always treated first class. And I've always envied the fact that if we got an opportunity, we should treat people differently, because I've seen and been to the airports when people beg me to do this for them, that for them, because they're finding it difficult to get in the country and to even get past immigration. It was a horror story when Guyana was almost banned from the rest of the Caribbean.
Yes. And the point that you make there of treating our fellow Caribbean brothers and sisters differently is very, 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 very important. Professor, the universal movement of labor would mean that services will have to be integrated as our education service. Healthcare. Talk us through that.
Well, services is a very difficult thing to integrate, because services are usually delivered in the person. And that will imply the movement of the person. But some countries would buy a service, but they don't want to buy the person who supplies the service or the enterprise that supplies the service in their own country. Tourism is our best example of that type of trade. Many people, I think the primary service in this export in this region is tourism. And tourism really means that we advertise the islands and the other countries in the CARICOM region, Suriname, Guyana, as tourist destinations. And the tourist comes here and buys the service here. That is the facilities we offer, whether it be entertainment, whether it be restaurants, transportation, whatever it is. And that's how the service is paid. And we get a lot of income from that type of trade in services. In fact, some islands depend primarily on that as their means of creating livelihoods. And so that is a very important part. But trade and services has become even more complex and complicated, because right now I can work for a firm in the United States without leaving my computer desk that I'm talking at here. And I can sell my service without being in the United States, or even so I don't physically have to move. And I can transfer my skills to deliver a product to whoever wants to buy it over there. So services become more complex, more complicated, and it has grown remarkably since the 2000s. But prior to that, this was the marginal part of overall trade. But now it dominates, expertise dominates the trade in many, many countries. So you can buy a banking service from Guyana, anywhere in the world that the regulations permit you to buy it from. You can buy a book anywhere in the world and read it online. You don't even ever physically see the book. Trade and services has become extraordinarily complex.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost a separate category of trade from the trade most persons learn as textbooks already, with the trade in goods. Although they call it trade in goods and services, most of our early training and trade is on goods, sugar, bauxite, timber, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the growth in services has been very rapid and in almost every sector of life.
Yeah.
The people who buy medical services, you don't have to go to a hospital in Brooklyn. You can buy the medical services online.
Yeah. Yeah. Professor, let me ask you this. It may be a little futuristic, but I think it's a question that must come into play. We don't have a single currency. The OECS has a single currency, but the rest of us in the CARICOM region, we have our own currencies. How does this free movement of labor press the question of a single currency?
Well, I think ultimately the exchange rates will have to be harmonized and then they would evolve, I think, into a single CARICOM currency. It could be like the euro, and then the national currencies remain, but there's a single currency which trades in the market, and which becomes the anchor on which the other currencies hang themselves. Even though, because Europe has a single currency, the euro, but the euro doesn't necessarily circulate in every country. You go to Britain, you deal mainly in pounds, but the euro is very important to trade in Europe. You would have dealt in pounds if Britain was still a member of the European Union.
Mm-hmm. And I think a
Because the
couple of the
pound
Scandinavian countries also have
have
the
one, yeah.
yes.
Own.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Well, that's what's happened in the Caribbean. The small islands
Right.
could not afford central banks because these are costly establishments. So they unified their efforts across 7 states and created the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank.
Yeah.
I was a speech giver at the launch of that.
Right. Professor, as usual, we want to tease our next topic. Over the weekend, the opposition leader announced that APNU has finally embraced the Buxton proposal as a policy. Your initial reaction?
I'm happy for that. It might encourage me to make a third attempt to revise it.
Right, yes.
Because I think, as time has passed, it needs some modification, not in any fundamental principle, but to deal with the time that has passed and to deal with the different stage at which production has reached in Guyana. Because remember, when it first came out, we hadn't yet even agreed. The companies were not yet admitting we had more than 3 million barrels of oil.
Yeah.
So in that document, I estimated we had 13 to 15. and based my predictions on that, and now they're admitting 12. And the government has put out 24 or 25, because I see two different figures quoted by them in their advertisements for the public auction. So you can see how much time has moved on. Although it's not a long time, but how much has moved on in a short period of time. Because we found oil in 2019, December, we started our first production. December 2019, and this is just 3 full years, 2021, 22.
Yeah.
Even I did not anticipate we would move from being where we were, the least developed country or low developed country, to a high income country in such short a space of time. But I think that that could be misleading though, because the figures are based largely on GDP output.
Yes, yes, yes. And I'm glad you said that. I don't know if you saw the exchange between Professor Gampat and one of the young propagandists from the PPP, Joel Bagundin, and Professor Gampat's letter pointing out that some of the figures, and he did reference you in his letter, that some of the figures that these young economists supporting the government are using might be misleading. Did you see that exchange?
No, I didn't see it, but I have it. I've taken out the clipping.
Oh, you've taken it out, right?
I'm due to read it.
It's quite interesting. Next week we can.
I know Ganpat. He used to be the statistician at the United Nations.
Oh, right,
very distinguished person, very senior person too. I think he dedicated his whole life to that. He came here after he retired.
Yes,
I knew me as an excellent scholar.
Yeah. And when he referenced you, I kind of smiled, because I know that you're a stickler for updating accuracy. You don't play with that at all. And
I always tell him, if you say I said so, show me it in print.
Yes, and so I smiled when I saw that. One other thing, I want to get a quick response for you from your colleague, Brother Yusiko, and our colleague, did a Quayana thing this past week, in that he chided, I think, an Exxon official who was talking about all the big investment of the oil company, and insinuating that Guyana is not investing in typical Guyana fashion. He said, well, Guyana is the biggest investor because the oil belongs to Guyana. And of course, the other side, I don't think had an answer to that. Your quick comment on that.
Well, the point is, as we know from the PSA, that's what I was telling you originally.
Yeah.
It was pushed as a part of a progressive agenda.
Yeah.
That the ownership of the oil will remain. Because prior to that, what investors would come in and do is explore for the oil, and when they found it, own the land and everything, and wherever it was found. But what we signed on to was a PSA, which allows us to own the oil and to hire operators to operate the oil. So, and that is why I said it's necessary for us to have a national company.
That's right.
Because by having a national company generated out of the ownership, we are party to the decisions that are being made.
Yes, yeah.
And we don't expose ourselves to the presumption that contribution starts when the oil is discovered. And whoever is producing it are the entitled appropriators of the benefit. Because the company part of the company is producing it.
Right.
I think we have a simple solution. I don't know why the government does not even encourage any discussion of that. All those criticisms will disappear.
Yeah. Professor Clive Thomas here, and I smiled, Professor, again when I think Dr. Randolph Passat could not respond to Guyana. And I said, you know what is missing here? Because we don't have a national oil company. They don't, because they're not trained in economics, or we are trained in political science and so on. You know, if there was a national company, we can wrap our head around the concept that Guyana is an investor. But in the absence of a national oil company, we feel as though the only investors are the others that are coming in. And I think it's just a lack of trust.
And I think it's a strategic move for us to do that.
Yes, yes.
It's an important psychological move.
Yes.
And it's a real move too, because companies are governed by company law 90% of the time. They have to operate in a national environment, that's true, and in the international environment. But really what's supposed to guide their behavior is company law, because that's where they're registered under.
Yeah.
That's where they operate, and that's what has to give them guidance. So we should not abandon that opportunity.
Professor Clive Thomas, thank you very much for coming through again this week. And as usual, next week when we come back, we are going to open up some of the issues that we have teased at the end of the program. The whole question of the cash transfers and as they are linked to poverty and so forth next week. Thank you, Professor.
You mentioned it, David. Always happy.
And thank you all for staying with us through another edition of our podcast. But don't disappear, because immediately after this podcast, we're going to have part 2 of our Politics 101, which is going to be our normal commentary and discussion. Today, of course, we are having what they call in sports a double header. Starting off with this discussion with Professor Thomas, and then immediately after this, we're going to go into part 2 of our discussion of politics, on Politics 101. So don't go anywhere. Part 2 is coming up.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we woman and we children.